Hello, everybody. My name is Brandon Hutton, and my teammates are Benjamin Striel and Rebecca Castelli. Today, we'll be presenting our final project over cache implications of aggressively pipelined high-performance microprocessors.
Our project analyzed the work explained in the published research paper dated 2004 titled Cache Implications of Aggressively Pipelined High-Performance Microprocessors. In this paper, the authors explored the effect of cache size on performance for various pipeline lengths. At the time this experiment took place, other researchers have explored different pipeline depths and their effect on performance at length. However, almost no studies have deeply investigated how various cache sizes can contribute to the performance of a processor. As a result of this experiment, they concluded based on their presented results that larger caches were extremely beneficial for performance, even with the slower lookup times, limited pipeline depth, and slower clock speed.
So, getting into the related work, the authors of the original research paper definitely gave credit to where it was due, and they noticed that a lot of research had been done on different processors to optimize pipeline depth. Some of the examples are listed here. For example, Kunkel and Smith on the Cray-IS simulator, they analyzed practical limitations of pipelines like instruction dependency, latch overhead, control paths, and also Sprengel and Carmine on the Intel Pentium 4 processor, where they demonstrated that longer pipelines on that processor will increase clock frequency and improve performance. So really the whole idea behind this paper is not to study a more optimization of pipeline depth, but rather the cache implications involved with that.
In order to carry out our experiments, we used the Gem5 architecture simulator, which is an open source software capable of simulating several instruction set architectures, such as x86, ARM, RISC, and more. We configured Gem5 to run our benchmark code at a variety of pipeline depths and cache sizes. Pipeline depths range from 7 to 50 stages, with clock speeds from 4.5 to 19.9 GHz, and cache sizes range from 1 kilobyte to 512 kilobytes for the level 1 instruction and data caches. The calculated cache latency and clock cycles for each cache pipeline pair was used in the configuration as well. All other factors such as level 2 cache, main memory, and more were kept constant between the tests. The benchmarks were written by the team, with a total of 4 integer and 4 floating point benchmarks being written in C.
The pipeline organization for our experiment was identical to the one used on the reviewed research paper. The maximum clock rate was determined by dividing the total logic depth by the number of stages and the pipeline overhead of 1.8 FO4s is added to each stage. It was shown that shorter pipelines perform better with slower clock rates and that longer pipelines require less logic per stage and can operate at higher clock speeds. This experiment overestimates the benefits of deep pipeline by assuming that all processor logics can be perfectly pipelined regardless of depth.
So in order to validate the original author's results successfully, we needed to emulate all the parameters that they were using in their simulator and ours. So one of these things includes their memory hierarchy calculations. So we emulated them by using a split four-way set associative of level 1 instruction and data cache, both with 32-byte block sizes and a unified 2 megabytes. Four-way set associative level 2 cache with 64-byte blocks. Then we also used calculated latencies from the original paper as seen in table 2 on the right. And this latency got calculated by access time divided by processor cycle time. And you can see in the table they have the pipeline depths that we use 7, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40, and 50. And obviously, as the pipeline depth increases, the period will decrease. That calculation is done with the formula on the left, and they rounded it to an integer. Tables 3 and 4 could also see these calculations based off cache size, and then table 4 sums it up. So these are the actual parameters we used for our simulation with the depths I mentioned before, cache sizes ranging from 1 to 512 kilobytes, and the latencies that were calculated in those tables.
System Systems in Gem 5 can be conveniently configured using Python scripts. Gem 5 provides a large library of classes that represent different components of the system, such as RAM, caches, memory buses, and more. These classes can be extended and pass parameters to set up the system as the user desires. As you can see on this slide, we extended the provided cache class to create an L1 cache class with default values for associativity and latencies. We also created a class for the level 2 cache, which isn't shown here. Once classes in Gem 5 are instantiated in the main configuration script, they are known as sim objects. Each sim object in a system represents a component of the processor, and Gem 5 automatically collects relevant statistics for each sim object, which is a huge help in collecting experimental results. Once all of our sim objects have been created, they must be linked together to create a coherent system. To achieve this, Gem 5 uses the system class as the root of the processor, and all other sim objects are descendants of the system class. As we add sim objects to the system object tree, we pass them parameters to configure them according to our needs. Some of these parameters are command line arguments, and some are hard-coded, since they will remain constant for all experiments. To actually run the benchmarks, we created a shell script that iterated over all the configurations we wanted to test and passed the necessary arguments to the configuration script, while also creating an organized structure of directories to hold the statistics of each experiment. We then used a Python script to compile the results into a spreadsheet for easy graphing.
A commonly used tools to measure the performance of a processor is to determine the number of instructions it can complete in a given time. The figures on the right represent a graph of the performance of each configuration tested in this experiment. It's measured in billions of instructions per second. Each point on the graph represents the average performance for all the benchmarks of that particular group. And on our experiment, we have two groups, which is the integer and the floating point. The lines on the graph highlight the cache sizes that was used to perform that experiment. We can see that shorter pipelines with higher cache sizes perform better because they have less cache misses and more cache hits, even though they have a slower clock rate. However, deeper pipelines perform worse than shorter pipelines, even though they have faster clock rates, which also causes um, more cache misses. Cache miss rates also plays a role in determining the performance of a processor. So in our experiment, we also analyzed the cache miss rates for each benchmark group, the integer benchmark, and the floating point benchmark. The graphs on the right shows a miss rate for each cache size for both the instruction L1 cache and the data L1 cache. Based on the results, we can see that as the cache sizes grows, we have less and less miss rates and more cache hits, which can help boost the performance of the processor, which explains why deeper pipelines have more cache miss, so they perform worse than uh, shorter pipelines with more cache hits. Cache miss rates also plays a role in determining the performance of a processor. So in our experiment, we also analyzed the cache miss rates for each benchmark group, the integer benchmark, and the floating point benchmark. The graphs on the right shows a miss rate for each cache size for both the instruction L1 cache and the data L1 cache. Based on the results, we can see that as the cache sizes grows, we have less and less miss rates and more cache hits, which can help boost the performance of the processor, which explains why deeper pipelines have more cache miss, so they perform worse than uh, shorter pipelines with more cache hits.
Let's take a look at how our results stack up to real-world processor design. Using a comprehensive CPU database available on techpowerup.com, I looked at the latest releases from both Intel and AMD, the two biggest manufacturers of consumer CPUs on the market. Most of Intel's latest releases in their i9 series, which is their selection of high-performance consumer CPUs, have at least 64 kilobyte level 1 caches, with up to 1 megabyte or sometimes even larger level 2 caches, as well as shared level 3 caches of 20 to 30 megabytes. These processors have base clock speeds a little above 3 GHz, but can boost up to around 5 GHz. AMD's Ryzen 9 processors, which are their closest analog to the Intel i9s, opted for faster clock speeds, usually in the 3.3 to 3.8 GHz range, and most commonly with 64 kilobyte level 1 caches, 512 kilobyte level 2 caches, and shared 16 megabyte level 3 caches. The team also attempted to locate information on the pipeline depths of these processors, but that unfortunately proved difficult to find. However, even without this data, it seems that these decisions from real-world processor designers validate the results of our experiments. It's clear from these numbers that both companies opted for cache size over clock speed and presumably pipeline depth, likely because the research identified similar trends to those found in our experiments. Overall, it seems processors that rely on large caches tend to perform better than those that opt for deep pipelines and high clock speeds.